Hello. So to continue and wrap up, that's the personal reason for, say, Lear being very dear, not just dear to me, but a play that really struck a nerve with me. Um, so the parents were just in a sort of mad state of concern, right? For me and for my friend who. Uh, Again, we were in a place where really there was no danger of being run over or anything like that, and yet it occurred to me that the parents had been damaged by the death of their child, and that did register some sort of it registered as some sort of pain that I could not myself understand, and yet I could understand that it was more extreme than other pain that I had experienced myself or imagined, heard about, and so on, right? So that was one of those milestone moments of registering what pain can be like uh, without recognizing fully what it is. It happens that several years down the road, I was at university, I was back home visiting my parents, my family, and we had moved off campus because by this point my father had retired, and my mother was working at another hospital. Anyway, I was in bed. These noises, I'm sorry, are just emails from school popping up, and I don't know what I can do to stop them. I'm worried that if I minimize the volume there, I might compromise your lecture. I don't know, but can I risk it and have to redo the entire thing? I don't want to. So just forgive these jingle jangle sounds that emerge every now and again. So I was still in bed, waking up. Strangely, my best friend, the best friend who was part of the story earlier on, was also, she was one of our house guests at that point, right? So she was also visiting, and she was staying with me because her parents were out of town, and she wanted to stay at well, she wanted to stay with me because we are very close friends. So she was also there. I was waking up and just lazing around in bed, and I overheard my mother on the phone, and she was clearly listening to something, some news that someone was offering her, and I could tell that from what her tone was, but also from just the kind of broken language, that something horrible had happened. And it turned out that the same couple who had told me and my friend to be careful crossing the street lost their only other child, also in a horrific accident which had taken place. Apparently, their daughter, who'd just gotten married and was on her honeymoon, she was relocating to the US, and they were, I think, driving. Her husband and she were driving to someplace to go on their honeymoon when there was a terrible accident, and she died on the spot. Um, and I remember thinking, this cannot be a right world for those parents, at least, right? That the world could not make sense. That years apart, almost the same thing happens again and destroys, eradicates their children, right? I didn't meet the parents again, right? After that day when I ran into them on the streets, I might have run into them one or two other times, just in different scenarios, but I had not seen them in years when I heard about this, and I've not seen them since. I don't know where they are. Um, but I remember thinking the world must have stopped for them. Um, it it is not that it was no longer making sense. The world must have ceased to exist as it did. Um, and I kept wondering, how do they go on? Um, because they have to, in some form or another, um, perform, right? Perform life. Um, and I had read Lear a few times at least by this point. But I remember rereading it that week, and the pain that I knew these parents were going through um, became something real, became something that was represented in Lear. And I thought, this is what the play in some ways is about: a world that stops. And there are some people who understand that they must forge on, and they must perform as though the world is moving on, as though life goes on. And then there are some who really cannot perform. When the world is turned upside down, when the world ceases to be meaningful, when the world and all of its utterances about common sense and about social norms and mores are proven wrong. Some of us manage to cling to whatever shreds of decency and normalcy we can find in order to perform a humanity that perhaps no longer makes sense to even us. And then there are those of us who just refuse to play along, right, in whatever way. So I think that is what makes the play really great, that it has the audacity to show us without sterility, without cleanliness, without beauty, a world that is in its best case turned upside down, and in its worst that does not exist. And when I say does not exist, you must think, well, how silly. Does not exist coherently. The gaps that we will talk about in this lecture, what remains of the 15 minutes, and in subsequent 1 or 2 lectures, will concentrate on these points, right? On the points where the world does not make sense, or that if it makes sense, it is through extreme artifice, and that artifice is so precariously and tentatively put in place that when it collapses under external or other pressures, what we see are gaping holes, right, of social logics, of psychological failings, and of affective or emotional. I'm sorry, my ear is itching. Of emotional or affective crises, right? So these are, I think, some of the gaps. So one of the gaps that I'll begin with is, of course, the most obvious one between parent and child, right? What is the bond between parent and child? And this is something which has emerged, well, just about in every play that we've read, right? Can you tell my teacup is not hot anymore? I'm like holding it so boldly. So every play, without fail, I would say, that we have covered, forces us to consider what exactly is the bond between a parent and his child. And I say his because it is, of course, very gender specific. All the parents we've run into in the plays that we've covered this semester have been male parents, and that is not a coincidence. We talked about the historical possibilities for this, the historical reasons that there were more fathers than mothers on Shakespeare's stage, but it can't be without effect that the father plays parent to very often female children, right? And in The Tempest we see that, in Merchant of Venice we see that, in Othello we see that, in, of course, Lear we see that as well, right? So, well, in Polonius's case we see that in Hamlet too. So let's think about, well, we see that in Midsummer Night's Dream. Again, it is, I want to say, quite outrageous, right? That the father, and the single father, so to speak, and the daughter's dynamic is something which repeatedly draws attention to what might be a very important, if not the most important, question that Shakespeare poses regarding the parent-child dynamic. What is this bond? And is it a bond that is based on affiliations that are socially constructed? Is it a bond that is visceral, that is bodily established, right? Or is it a bond that is a fantasy, that is something that we impose upon our realities because it is such a beautiful fantasy? So with that, maybe I should start a new lecture instead of just letting the last 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes of this, 2 minutes of this lecture carry on. So what I will do is I will look to Lear and his daughters, but before we get into Cordelia, I would like to look at Goneril and Regan and their relationship to Lear, move into perhaps Cordelia, then look at Gloucester, Edgar and Edmund, and talk about the various gaps that show up, emerge in these circuits, right, the nuclear family circuits. Keeping also in mind that Lear, as king, might have been parent to, or might be considered parentally toward, what an awful construction, might be understood as parent and father to his people too. So there is this entire environment of father and child that emerges. The Fool and Lear also have a parent and child unit, perhaps, encased or ensconced in their dynamic. Although it's an interesting question to ask yourself, how old is the Fool, right? Many of the reasons offered for the Fool kind of disappearing in the middle of the play, never to emerge again, have to do with the possibility that maybe the actor playing Cordelia also played Lear, and for Cordelia to return to stage, the Fool has to disappear. If that is the case, then the Fool might be a very young Fool, but there could also be a sense based on his language and his observations about Lear and the world around Lear, that he is almost as old as Kent, perhaps, so at least of middling years, if not older. But we'll start with the daughters and then move into the sons in just a couple.